What would you do if your child vanished into the forest, and what you found wasn't a kidnapper, but a towering creature cradling him like a mother? In the fall of 1991, deep in the Appalachian woods, a single mother named Nora discovered something no one believed could be real. Meera, a massive ash-gray being who didn't harm children, but protected them. She had once saved dozens of lost or abandoned kids, warmed them with moss, and drew symbols of home in the dirt, until fear turned her into a hunted monster. Bailey, now a researcher, was once one of those children. In this video, you'll uncover who Meera truly is, why missing children were drawn to her, and what made a grieving sheriff lay down his gun to protect her. Nora witnessed Meera running into a burning forest to save her dying child. And when the village raised their torches, an old man stepped in front of a bullet to protect what they all misunderstood. This isn't just folklore. It's a forgotten truth. And if you scroll past this, you may never find out who the real monsters were. The morning broke soft and silver, sunlight barely cutting through the fog-draped pines that wrapped around the Everett house like a secret. The Appalachian woods, damp with October breath, stood still as if the trees themselves were holding something in. A woodpecker hammered somewhere out in the distance. Steam rose from the mossy shingles of the cabin roof, curling into the sky like thin ghosts. And inside the house, Nora threaded one final line of green onto her embroidery hoop. Then paused. Somewhere out back, laughter. Frankie and Jamie. Two voices, one sharp, one soft, chasing each other around the stumps and the swing set faded by years of West Virginia rain. It was their game. Hide and seek, but with new rules made up every 5 minutes. Nora let the sound wash over her like a song she knew by heart. She sipped her tea. The kitchen smelled of toast and pine resin. Bailey was at the sink, humming quietly to herself, scrubbing plates from breakfast, her auburn hair tied back, sleeves damp. Then silence. Not a slow fade, not a tired wind down, just gone. No laughter, no footfalls, no calling of names. Just that heavy, unnatural kind of quiet that makes the hair behind your neck rise without permission. Nora looked up. Blinked once. Bailey turned too, like something invisible had tapped her shoulder. Nora stepped onto the porch barefoot, letting the cold planks shock her skin awake. The woods were still wrapped in that low fog, thick enough to taste. A squirrel darted across the yard. No Jamie, no Frankie. She walked toward the swing set. Leaves crackled beneath her heel. She saw the blue beanie first, half buried in wet leaves, sitting like someone had placed it down with care. It didn't make sense. Jamie never took that hat off. She crouched, fingers shaking as she lifted it. It was damp, but warm. Not long gone. Her stomach dropped into some cold, ancient place. "Frankie," her voice cracked. "Frankie, where's your brother?" The 5-year-old stood just beyond the cedar tree, not hiding, not moving. His eyes were too wide for a child his age. He pointed. His voice was barely a whisper. He went with the big lady, the one with messy hair, and her kid. Nora froze. "What kid?" Frankie didn't blink. "The one with the squished face." Bailey dropped the plate. It shattered into 6 pieces across the kitchen floor, but she didn't look down. She was already out the door. "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "No, it can't be." Nora spun toward her. "Bailey, what's going on?" Bailey's hands were shaking. "You have to trust me, just this once." Then she grabbed Nora's wrist, tighter than expected, and pulled her into the tree line. They didn't take the trail. They didn't take any trail. They moved through undergrowth and bramble, leaves clinging to their jeans, sharp branches slicing at their skin. Bailey didn't speak. Nora's breath came hard, chest stinging. But something in Bailey's urgency overruled the panic screaming at her to stop. A mile in, Nora saw it. The tracks, one set, tiny. Her son's, barefoot. Then beside it, massive prints. sunk deep into the loam, almost double the size of any man she'd ever met. The shape of a foot, yes, but wrong. The weight of it left the moss crushed into the earth. What is this? Nora's voice cracked. Bailey's jaw clenched. It's them. What do you mean, them? They're not monsters. Her voice was low, shaky. I know them. I swear to God. I thought I imagined them for years, but they're real. Meera and her child, Luma. Nora didn't know what to say. Her legs wanted to stop walking, but her heart was already too deep in. Bailey pulled aside a curtain of hanging moss, revealing a narrow ravine that ran like a scar through the woods. The stream at its base sparkled in the morning haze. Then they saw them. Across the ravine, down by the water, Jamie, sitting on a stone, giggling softly. And next to him, a figure, crouched. Immense. Too tall for a man. Covered in hair the color of ash and silver bark. Shoulders like an ox. Arms long and sinewy, reaching down to the stream. But it wasn't the size that caught Nora's breath. It was the way it moved. Gentle, still. It reached out and placed a massive hand on Jamie's back. Carefully, protectively. And beside the giant, a smaller shape. The child. Crooked spine, lopsided head. One arm curled close to its body, as if broken long ago and never set right. And yet, there was no fear in Jamie's face, no tears, just trust. The large creature looked up. Eyes met hers. Not beast's eyes, not dull or feral. Eyes full of sorrow, of patience, of something like guilt. Bailey whispered, She found him, like she found me. Nora couldn't look away. Her knees weakened beneath her, but she didn't fall. Because in that moment, under the weight of those woods, with the wind holding its breath and the river whispering things only trees could understand, she realized something terrible and beautiful all at once. Her son hadn't been taken. He had been kept safe. The creature, no, the mother, had been watching, not as a predator, but as someone who had known loss too many times to let it happen again. And just like that, nothing in Nora's world made sense anymore. It was the same cedar tree, bent from age, blackened along one side by lightning long ago, and still rooted in the heart of the forest like it had been waiting for someone to return. Bailey stood beneath it again for the first time in a decade. Her fingers brushed the scar across its trunk, the one she'd carved herself with a jagged rock when she was 9. Just an X, but it had meant something back then. It had meant she wasn't invisible. The woods were breathing around her, damp and quiet. Sunlight barely reached the moss-covered ground. Bailey crouched down, pressing her hand flat against the dirt, and whispered like she was talking to the tree. I was a lost kid, too. Nora stood a few steps behind, holding Jamie close. The boy was quiet now, sleepy, his head tucked into the crook of her neck. Her eyes kept drifting back to the spot near the stream where Meera had been. The image wouldn't leave her. Those eyes, those long arms, the way the creature had touched her son's back like a lullaby. Bailey didn't look up. She started to speak, and it came out not like a confession, but like something that had been trapped behind her ribs for years. My dad used to hit me when he drank. Not just a slap. Mean hits, the kind that make your teeth rattle. The forest didn't respond. It didn't have to. My mom left when I was 8. No warning, no note. He said she ran off with a man from Ohio, and maybe she did. But I remember the night I ran into these woods. It was raining, real cold. I didn't care. I thought if I could just make it to the ridge, I'd be safe. Nora didn't interrupt. Jamie shifted in her arms. Somewhere in the branches above, a raven called once, then fell silent again. I got lost. For 2 nights. I don't remember the first one, only that everything hurt. My feet were bleeding. I ate leaves because I didn't know which berries wouldn't kill me. Bailey's voice wavered, then steadied. Then she found me. She finally looked up, eyes locked with Nora's. She didn't make a sound. Just walked out from the fog like the woods had coughed her up. She was massive. I thought I'd die right there. But then she knelt down, held out her hand, like this Bailey extended her palm slowly, exactly the way Meera had done it years ago. Her fur was soaked. She smelled like ash and pine sap, and she put her hand on my chest, right over my heart. Then she drew a circle on the dirt between us. Bailey's finger moved in the damp soil again, making that same circle. It meant home. At least that's what I think. She didn't say anything. She never did. Nora blinked. Her throat tightened. The part of her that had been screaming with maternal fear just an hour ago was now tangled in something deeper. Grief, recognition, wonder, all tangled like vines in her gut. "They gave me food," Bailey said. "Roots, soft berries. They built me a little bed out of moss. The smaller one, Luma, she didn't speak either. Half her face is twisted like it never grew right. But her eyes," she trailed off. Nora didn't need her to finish. "She played with me," Bailey went on. "We didn't talk, but it didn't matter. She laughed when I threw stones in the river. The sound she made, it wasn't quite a laugh, more like a chirp. I stayed 3 days. Then a ranger found me and took me back. I never told anyone. No one would have believed me anyway." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "I called them Meera and Luma. I don't know if those are their names, but it felt right. I used to come back sometimes, not often, just to leave things, food, trinkets. And sometimes the woods would leave something back." Nora stepped forward, slowly. Jamie stirred and lifted his head, mumbling sleepily. That's when they heard the sound, something rustling through the brush. Not fast, not panicked, just moving. They turned and saw the smaller one, Luma. She came out from behind a curtain of ferns, limping slightly, her head tilted. Her features were harder to make out than Meera's, not because they were monstrous, but because they were wrong in ways the human brain didn't expect. One side of her jaw didn't move when she walked. One arm hung useless, curled in toward her chest. But in her good hand she held something. She stepped forward, not looking at Nora, but at Jamie. Then she extended the object. A doll, made of braided vine and moss, tiny sticks for arms, yellow threads for hair, dirty, faded, but still clearly once golden. Nora's blood ran cold. She knew that doll, 7 years ago, before her family moved to Marrowbone Ridge. They'd spent a summer near the Tennessee border. A storm had washed away their belongings during a river hike, including the canvas bag that had held Frankie's toys and Jamie's future hand-me-downs. This doll had been in that bag. She remembered because it had been hers too when she was a little girl. "How?" she whispered. Luma didn't answer, just looked at her, head tilted like a child who didn't understand why a gift could make someone cry. Nora sank to her knees. Bailey stood still, watching, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Not from anger, from the weight of memory. Nora looked into the child's eyes, if that's what she was. In that moment, species didn't matter. There was a language bigger than words. The same one mothers used when they tucked children into bed without speaking. The same one Jamie had responded to so naturally by the creek. She reached out slowly and took the doll, then pulled Jamie closer, holding him tight. When she looked up, Luma was already backing away, step by step, into the brush, swallowed by the green. "She didn't steal him," Nora murmured, almost to herself. "She watched him. She took care of him." Bailey exhaled, a breath that sounded like it had been waiting years to be let go. From somewhere deeper in the woods, a low hum began. Not a voice, not quite, but it vibrated through the pine trunks like wind through hollow bone. Meera was calling. Bailey and Nora didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stood beneath the old cedar, listening. It wasn't over, not even close. The cave was hidden behind a curtain of moss and stone so old it had forgotten sunlight. The entrance, narrow and hunched beneath a granite overhang, would have been invisible to anyone not already searching. Nora had to crawl on hands and knees, the cold bite of wet rock pressing into her palms, the air turning metallic and still the moment she entered. Bailey led the way, flashlight low, her breath shallow. The beam of light flickered against walls slick with condensation, revealing the raw, primitive shapes scrawled across the stone. They weren't just drawings. They were stories. Black lines made of ashen soot, streaked with reddish smears that looked like rust but smelled faintly of clay. Children, dozens of them, rendered in crooked outlines, hands raised, eyes wide. A larger shape stood among them, arms extended, never looming, never chasing, always protecting. Meera. You didn't need to be told. You just knew. Nora stood slowly, her back aching from the crawl, her gaze scanning wall after wall of ancient grief. There was one panel near the back, higher than the others. Meera's form knelt beside a tiny stick figure, one that had a single tear drawn on its cheek in what looked like berry dye. Around them were jagged marks, like slashes. Fire, guns, fear. And all throughout, repeated again and again, were images of eyes. Some open, some crossed out. Nora stepped closer. She reached out, her fingertips stopping just short of the stone. She remembers them, Bailey said quietly behind her. All of them. Nora turned. You think she drew this? Bailey nodded. She didn't forget a single child. The light dipped toward the floor and caught on a small pile of carved figures. Dolls made from bark and twine, each one different, some missing limbs, others with their faces melted or blurred. Jamie's vine doll had not been a one-off. Meera had been collecting for years, memorializing. They moved deeper in. The passage narrowed, then opened into a chamber lit by a crack in the stone ceiling where faint sunlight pooled like spilled milk. And there, at the far end, was a shape on the floor. It looked like a shrine, leaves arranged in spirals, stones laid in careful rings. In the center, the only thing that wasn't from the forest, a silver hair clip, tarnished, bent at the hinge. Nora stepped forward. She didn't realize her hands were shaking until she picked it up and saw the initials, T.S., scratched into the back in uneven lines. She stared at it, time folding in on itself. This was no longer about Jamie, or Luma, or Bailey. This was about something older than all of them. A girl long gone, a father who never left his mountain, and the thing in the woods that had tried, once, to bring her home. Nora turned the clip over in her palm. It was cold as death. She was real, Bailey whispered. Tilly. That's her name, right? Nora nodded slowly. Odell's daughter. They stood in silence, surrounded by stone and memory. The cave wasn't just a shelter. It was a map of heartbreak. A place Meera had come back to again and again, like a mother returning to the grave of a child who never made it home. Bailey knelt beside one of the drawings. She ran her hand gently along the chalky shape of a child with long hair, reaching up toward the sky. She tried to help, Bailey murmured. She always tried. Nora looked down the corridor they'd entered from, where light no longer reached. And for the first time, she understood something that had been clawing at the back of her thoughts since that morning by the creek. Meera wasn't hiding because she was a monster. She was hiding because she'd already survived 100 hunts, 1,000 rejections. She had failed once, and she would not let it happen again. Nora felt something twist behind her ribs. A tightness she hadn't noticed was there. She clenched her jaw to stop it from rising into her throat, but it came anyway. A slow, silent sob. She didn't cry like a mother afraid. She cried like a woman who had seen too much of what humans were capable of, and not enough of what they still might be. Later, they emerged from the cave into the graying afternoon, mist curling low to the forest floor like breath too tired to rise. The air smelled of wet stone and burning leaves somewhere far off. Nora tucked the hair clip into her coat pocket without a word. Jamie was asleep on a bed of moss, right where they'd left him, and Luma was beside him, half-curled like an animal and a child all at once. Her good eye opened when they approached, then closed again without fear. Meera stood nearby, barely visible between two tree trunks. Still, immense. Watching. Nora didn't move toward her. She didn't have to, because Meera stepped forward first, each step deliberate, her breath slow and heavy, chest rising with the sound of something mournful and old caught in the throat. Then she knelt. Her hand reached out, not toward Jamie this time, but toward Nora. Open. Empty. Offered. Nora's own hand moved without thinking, her fingers touching fur that was coarse but not unkind. Meera turned her palm, gently, and with her other hand she picked up a stick. Then she drew again, pressing it into the wet earth like a mother marking a family tree. 2 tall shapes, 2 small ones, a house with a crooked roof, and off to the side, one more figure, taller than all the others. Watching, Bailey wiped her eyes without trying to hide it. The woods around them held their breath. Then Meera reached into a pouch slung across her chest, woven from vine and something that looked like deer hide, and pulled out a rusted metal harmonica. She held it out. Nora didn't understand. Not yet, but she took it. Meera let go slowly, her fingers brushing Nora's. Then she rose, massive and graceful, and turned away. The forest swallowed her without a sound. And still, the memory stayed behind. In dirt, in stone, in the air itself. The sound of something beautiful trying to survive in a world that never gave it the chance. The cabin looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. Tucked deep into the belly of the forest, half swallowed by ivy and rot, it sat crooked on its foundation, its roof sagging like a tired breath. No path led there. No trail marked its way. The trees simply pulled back for a moment, just enough to let it exist. Bailey slowed her steps as they approached, as if the ground itself demanded reverence. Nora kept Jamie close on her hip, her arm aching but unwilling to let him down. Her boots sank into the soft moss, every step damp. Something about the clearing felt thinner than the rest of the woods, like the veil between past and present had worn away here. She hadn't said much during the walk. Not after the cave. Not after the harmonica. The weight of that tiny thing in her coat pocket felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried memory in its rusted seams. Odell didn't come out when they called. Didn't respond to Bailey's knock. But she didn't look surprised. She turned the handle, pushed the warp door open, and led Nora inside without a word. It was dark. Dust hung in the air like a held breath. The walls were lined with shelves, all hand-carved, packed with jars and stones and small bundles of dried plants tied in string. In one corner, a cast-iron stove sat cold. A rifle leaned against the door frame, and by the window, hunched over a table in the flickering light of a single oil lamp, sat a man with a back like a bent tree. He turned slowly. His face was a map of silence, creased, sun-darkened, and lined with a beard that might have been white once, but now was more ash than snow. His eyes, though, those were alive, sharp and unblinking, the kind of eyes that didn't miss much, because they'd already seen too much. Bailey stepped forward first. She didn't speak, just held out the harmonica. The old man stared at it for a long time. Then his lips parted, and he made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Just breath, memory, regret. He reached out with both hands and took it, cradling the small metal thing like a relic. Nora stepped in slowly. The floor creaked beneath her weight. "Odell," Bailey said finally, soft but steady. "We need to know what happened. Back then." He didn't answer. He stood, limping slightly, and moved toward the fireplace. Pulled a flint from a drawer. Lit the kindling. The fire caught with a slow hiss. Orange light growing across the room like a sunrise inside a coffin. Then he walked to a battered chest beneath the bookshelf. Pulled it open. He took out a bundle wrapped in canvas, untied it, and spread it across the table. Drawings. Pages yellowed and curled at the corners. Sketches in charcoal. All of the same figure. Tall, towering, furred. But not monstrous. The lines were too careful for that. In some, the creature cradled a child. In others, she stood alone beneath trees, Odell touched one image gently. A girl holding the creature's hand. Tilly. He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. He picked up a piece of chalk and moved to the wall behind the stove. A slate board hung there, mostly blank. He wrote slowly, hand shaking. 1974, rain, river too high, screaming, people, shotgun. Then he drew. The creature, the girl, a rope swing over the water, then X's, 3 of them. Bailey stepped closer. She tried to save her, didn't she? Odell nodded once. Nora whispered. But the town thought she was the threat. He looked at her. Something flickered in his eyes. He walked to a small drawer, pulled out a folded page torn from an old radio manual. The diagrams were smeared, wires marked in red ink. Odell pointed to it, then to the creature's ear, then to the words on the wall. Bailey understood before Nora did. She learned to speak, Bailey said. A little, from listening to your radio. He nodded again. Nora felt a knot form behind her ribs. She thought of Meera's attempt to draw a family in the dirt, of the cave full of children's ghosts, of the hush that had followed her wherever she went, like she had learned early on that silence was safer than language. She was never trying to hide, Nora said slowly. She was trying to reach out. Odell picked up the harmonica again. He turned it in his hands, then stepped outside. The clearing was still bathed in blue-gray light, the kind that only came before rain. The clouds were low, heavy, wrapped around the trees like smoke. Odell raised the harmonica to his lips and played. The sound was low, broken, wheezing at first. But then it grew steady, deep, a song without words. Not happy, not quite sad, just old. And from the trees, she answered. Meera didn't step into the clearing. She stayed at the edge, just visible between 2 trunks, a shape, almost part of the trees. Her eyes glowed faintly in the firelight. Odell didn't stop playing. The music wasn't for show. It wasn't to call her. It was to tell her. I remember. I still see her. When the song ended, the harmonica dropped to Odell's side, and he stood there, chest heaving. Meera didn't leave. She just stood, watching. Nora didn't move. She didn't breathe. Then Meera raised one arm, slowly, open palm, not in greeting, not in threat. In thanks, the wind picked up. A soft, low howl through the branches. Bailey stepped beside Nora, her voice a whisper. She came back for him, not because she had to, because she still believed someone might listen. The clearing dimmed. The light pulled back. The shadows thickened. Meera vanished into the trees. But the feeling didn't. Not for Odell, not for Nora, and certainly not for the woods. It started with a blur on a screen, grainy and still, like something caught in a dream too dark to remember. The frame showed trees bending in the wind, a patch of forest floor, then something shifting at the edge. The creature stepped into the light just long enough for the lens to catch the silhouette. Massive, upright, limbs heavy as trunks, moving not with menace, but with purpose. A low electronic click marked the frame, and then it was gone. Sheriff McLaren stood in the dark of his office, arms crossed, staring at the playback as it looped for the 6th time. His face didn't move, just the vein in his jaw twitching under the skin and the trembling of his fingers around the remote. The footage had come in from Carl Henson's trap cam, the one Carl wasn't supposed to set technically, but everyone in Marrowbone Ridge knew Carl stopped listening to regulations back in '87. The clock ticked louder than it should have. McLaren shut off the monitor and lit a cigarette with a match that flared too bright in the dark. The match hissed out. The room reeked of old smoke and wood polish. Behind him, on the wall, hung the picture of a little girl, his daughter. Wide smile, summer dress. Vanished 20 years ago in woods not far from where that footage had been taken. He didn't blink when he said it out loud. It's back. The next day, the town stirred. Carl had already run his mouth at the Elk's horn, which meant by morning, half the town was asking questions, and the other half was loading rifles. People had their theories. Some called it a bear walking funny, others said it was the Henderson boy in a suit. But McLaren didn't let the story spin too far before he took it back. Claimed the tape was inconclusive, said it could be doctored, said the station wouldn't comment further. But behind closed doors, he began making calls. By noon, 3 trucks had been loaded with gear. Lanterns, gasoline, bait, tranquilizer darts, and guns. Always guns. By dusk, the men started gathering near the ranger station. It wasn't official, not really, but it didn't need to be. There were too many memories in this town, too many things swallowed by the woods and never spit back. Grief has a way of fermenting into something sharp, something that smells like duty and tastes like revenge. Nora found out the way most things reached her, through a whisper, through Bailey, through that feeling in the gut that told her the wind had shifted. They were sitting at Odell's cabin when the knock came. It wasn't a knock, more like a single thump on the wood. Then a voice. "They're hunting." Bailey opened the door. Caleb Pryor, flannel half-buttoned, hair wet with sweat, eyes too wide. He didn't look at Nora, just kept talking. "Sheriff's bringing half the damn town. Says it's time we finish what we started. They got dogs. They're setting fires to flush it out." Bailey didn't wait to ask where. She was already pulling on her boots. Nora's heart dropped hard. Luma. They reached the cabin edge as the sky turned a bruised kind of blue. The woods were louder than usual, birds scattering, branches snapping in strange rhythms. Jamie had been left in the care of Bailey's cousin, someone they trusted, someone far from the smoke. They cut through the ridge path, past the ash tree with the hollow belly, past the place where Bailey had first drawn a circle in the dirt and called it home. The air grew hotter. Nora smelled it before she saw it. Smoke. Thin at first, then thicker, curling through the trees like fingers. Somewhere far ahead, dogs barked. Men shouted. The woods had turned into a hunting ground again. Bailey's voice shook. "They're trying to corner her." "Where would she go?" Nora's voice cracked from running. "She wouldn't run," Bailey said, then paused. "Unless she had to." Nora knew what that meant. If Luma was with her, if Luma couldn't move fast enough. They picked up speed. The trail forked near the stone ravine, and that's when they heard it. A cough, a wet, painful one. "Luma." Bailey called softly, like you'd call to a bird. "Meera." No response. Then, from behind a clump of thorn brush, Luma stepped out. She was swaying, eyes dull, cheeks sunken. Fever clung to her skin. Her breath rasped. She stumbled, caught herself. Meera followed seconds later. She didn't look like a legend then. She looked like a mother who had run too far, carried too much, watched too many things die. Bailey didn't ask. She ran forward, dropped to her knees, arms open. Meera hesitated. Then, slowly, gently, she placed Luma into Bailey's arms. Nora knelt too, checking the girl's forehead. Hot, too hot. "She's burning up, bacterial, maybe from the water, or—" She didn't finish. Meera was watching her, and she wasn't blinking. Bailey's voice cracked. "We'll take care of her. You trust us. You brought her. That means something." Meera didn't answer. She took one step back, then another, then turned and vanished into the trees. They didn't chase her. They carried Luma, half unconscious, back toward the cabin through a shortcut Odell had shown them. The smoke was thicker on that side of the ridge, but the fire hadn't reached there yet. By the time they arrived, the sun had nearly dipped behind the mountains. Odell was already waiting. He didn't speak, just opened the door, laid out a bed of pine needles and flannel, and began boiling water. They worked in silence. Herbs crushed, compresses laid, water filtered. Bailey sang, soft and cracked, a tune that might have been a lullaby or just something made up on the spot. Outside, the first embers began to drift across the sky like fireflies. And far, far off in the distance, a howl. Not a dog, not a coyote. It was lower, older, mournful, calling not for help, but for goodbye. And even though they all heard it, no one said a word, because some grief doesn't need repeating. Some grief just wants to be carried, quietly, carefully, until it becomes something else. It was sometime after midnight when the knock came. Not a knock, exactly. More like a soft, measured pressure against the wooden frame of the cabin door, just enough to stir the wind chimes without sound. Bailey had dozed off in the armchair, one hand still wrapped gently around Luma's fevered wrist, and Nora was sitting near the fire, turning over a piece of linen in her lap without sewing a single stitch. The room smelled of cedar bark, boiled herbs, and the quiet tension that comes from waiting for something you can't control to either die or survive. Odell had gone out hours earlier, searching for a rare root he said grew near the ravine edge, something old people used before penicillin ever had a name. His absence made the house feel unmoored, like a boat without its anchor. The knock came again, this time firmer. Nora rose slowly. Her legs were stiff from sitting too long, but her body moved on instinct now. She opened the door and stepped back. Meera stood in the doorway. She looked taller in the firelight. The outline of her fur was damp, matted with soot and fog, but her posture wasn't tired. It was deliberate. There was something ceremonial about the way she held her arms, palms turned outward, open. Her breath steamed in the cold night, slow and ragged. Behind her, the woods didn't move. Nora didn't speak. Meera stepped forward one pace, then carefully knelt, lowering something from her arms. It was Luma, or what was left of her strength. Her body was curled in a way that looked too small for anything that had ever run through trees or laughed at throwing stones. Her eyes were half closed, the fever bright on her cheeks, breath shallow and ticking like a faulty clock. Meera placed her down, gently, onto the blanket just inside the threshold, then turned her face up to Nora, not begging, not demanding, just asking, in the way only a mother who has run out of ways to help can ask. Please. Nora crouched, reached out, and touched Luma's forehead with the back of her hand. Still hot, maybe hotter than before. She felt Bailey stir behind her, heard the chair creak and the quick gasp of waking panic. She brought her, Bailey whispered. She brought her here. Meera stayed where she was, kneeling, unmoving. Nora looked up and met her eyes. Not monster eyes, not even animal eyes, just old eyes, worn out from watching and hoping and losing. Bailey rushed to lay out fresh cloth. Odell's fire had kept the room warm, but it was Luma's breathing that made the air feel thin. Nora pulled water from the kettle, steeped it with willow bark, and crushed dried leaves from Odell's bundles. Bailey pressed poultices to the girl's chest, whispered her name in half-formed prayers, over and over like a heartbeat. Meera sat outside the cabin, just beyond the doorway, back against the porch beam, arms wrapped around her knees. She never came in. She never tried. She didn't need to. Every few minutes, she would let out a low hum, barely audible, more vibration than sound, and Luma's body would shift toward it, like a tide leaning into the pull of the moon. The sound wasn't music, but it wasn't noise either. It was something else, something made for the space between waking and sleeping. They worked for hours. Odell returned just before dawn, soaked through and dragging a burlap sack of roots. He didn't ask questions, just looked at Meera, then at Luma, then got to work, crushing and mixing, pouring drops into a carved wooden spoon that looked older than the cabin itself. Bailey held Luma's head, and Nora helped her drink. The child didn't fight. When she coughed, it was quieter than before. Less raw, less final. The storm outside had passed, but the sky still held that gray quiet before morning, when everything seems still, but nothing feels safe yet. Nora pulled an extra quilt over Luma, tucked her arm beneath it, and finally let herself sit again. Bailey didn't sit. She stood at the window, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching Meera. She knew she couldn't save her, Bailey said, voice low and torn. She brought her here because she trusts us. Nora rubbed her eyes. No, not us. Bailey turned. "She trusts you," Nora said. They didn't say anything for a while. The fire popped. Luma stirred. Odell dozed off, half upright, a hand still wrapped around the pestle in the bowl. Outside, the woods began to shift. Not with threat, just with mourning. Meera stood. She didn't knock again. She didn't wait. She walked to the edge of the trees and stood there, tall and still, head lifted like she was listening to something far beyond the pines. Then she tilted her head back and let out a long, low call. Not a scream, not a roar. Something between a lullaby and a memory. A sound not meant for ears, but for the bones underneath. It carried. Nora felt it in her teeth. Bailey leaned against the window like the glass had taken her breath. Odell stirred, opened one eye, nodded once. The sound faded. Meera stepped into the trees and disappeared. They didn't follow. The sun finally pushed up over the ridge, pale and cold. Luma slept. Her breathing, for the first time in days, was steady, and though the house remained quiet, there was no silence anymore. Because silence is what you hear when no one is listening. And now, someone finally was. It started with smoke. Not the soft curl of wood smoke from a cabin chimney, but the thick, clinging kind that stains your lungs before your eyes can see it. The kind that doesn't rise. It crawls. Beneath the tree line near Black Hollow Ridge, the wind had changed. It blew inward now, toward the heart of the woods, toward the hiding place of something no one in town truly understood, but many feared anyway. Bailey smelled it first. She was rinsing a cloth in cold water, wiping the fever from Luma's cheeks, while Nora added another layer of boiled pine bark to the poultice. The girl had finally begun to sleep, and her breathing no longer clawed at the air. Odell, sharpening an old blade in the corner, paused. His hand stopped mid-motion. Then the dog started howling. Far off. Not one, but several. Echoing over the ridge in frantic bursts. The way they only did when they smelled something alive. And cornered. Odell didn't speak. He rose, went to the back of the cabin, and opened the trunk he hadn't touched in years. Inside, a faded green duffel bag. Military style. He took out a folded canvas map, traced a line with his finger that curved along a dry riverbed, and nodded once. Then he grabbed the carved wooden flute and stepped outside. Nora followed him without a word. Bailey stayed only long enough to tuck the blankets tighter around Luma's small frame, brushing a strand of hair from her face, whispering something that cracked halfway through. Then she was gone too. The fire was already visible from the ridge. It hadn't reached the treetops yet, but the base of the pines glowed like coal. Bright, angry. The scent of gasoline rode in on the breeze, unmistakable and wrong. It wasn't a wildfire. It was a message. "We're coming!" The townsfolk had grown impatient. Too many rumors, too many missing things, too many questions that the sheriff never stopped asking. McLaren led them. He stood at the edge of the controlled burn in his worn boots, shotgun in hand, barking orders like he was back in the war he never fought. Faces around him nodded. They weren't evil men, just tired ones, scared ones. Men who had buried too many things in this soil and convinced themselves that the woods had stolen it all. McLaren had already made peace with whatever he might find, so long as it couldn't be forgiven. Bailey, Nora, and Odell reached the old trailhead just before dawn. The mountain path was steep, nearly forgotten, overgrown with brambles and old roots that snagged their boots. They moved fast. Odell's breathing was labored, his limp more pronounced with every step. But he didn't stop. He didn't even ask who they were trying to save. He knew. Somewhere beyond the fire line, Meera was still hiding. She wouldn't run. Not unless Luma called, which was why, as the three of them climbed higher, they carried her voice with them. Bailey had the harmonica, not played since Meera left it in Nora's hand weeks earlier. Now she lifted it to her lips and blew. Not a melody, but a single drawn-out note that trembled in the mountain air like an echo from another life. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. It threaded through the pines like a memory that refused to stay buried. And from far away, too far to see, something answered. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't human. But it answered. Then came the crash of underbrush. Something large, something fast. Footsteps that didn't belong to any man. Meera burst from the edge of the ravine, her silver-gray fur streaked with soot, her chest heaving as she emerged through the haze. Her eyes burned, not with anger, but with the wild panic of a mother hearing her child's voice too close to the fire. Odell didn't slow. He raised his hand, made the sign in the dirt again, circle 2 small dots. Meera saw it. She didn't blink. Behind them, the trees split. McLaren's group broke through the smoke like ghosts. Shotguns raised, flashlights scanning. The beam caught Meera full in the face, and for a moment, the entire forest held its breath. She didn't growl. She didn't run. She stood, tall and still, her hands open at her sides. McLaren didn't hesitate. His finger curled on the trigger. But before the sound of the shot, there was movement. Odell stepped forward. No shout. No warning. He moved into the line of fire like someone who had been waiting to do it his whole life. The gun cracked once, a sound louder than thunder, sharper than the fall of trees. Odell dropped without a sound. The light from the fire caught his eyes for a moment before they closed, soft and grateful, as if the weight had finally lifted from his chest. Bailey screamed. Nora fell to her knees beside him. Meera didn't move. She didn't lash out. She knelt beside the man who had once built her music, placed her hand over his heart, and lowered her head. The fire licked closer. The wind shifted again, and just like that, she rose. She stepped back into the trees, into the smoke, into the part of the forest that never gave things back. By the time the men reached the clearing, she was already gone. McLaren stood over the body. His hands were trembling now. He looked down at the man he'd killed, then at the faces staring back at him. No one said a word. No one looked like they'd found what they came for. The fire stopped spreading. The wind died. But what had been lit couldn't be undone. By the next morning, the flames had been stamped out, the guns lowered, the trucks packed. But not everything could be taken home. Odell stayed where he'd fallen. The earth was soft there, quiet, and somewhere out past the ridgeline, near the cave with the drawings no one dared touch, a mother walked alone again. This time not because she had to, but because it was the only way to keep from breaking. And even then, the breaking had already begun. By early December, the cabin sat quiet under a thin crust of snow, as if the forest had decided to hush everything down to a whisper. The smoke from the chimney had stopped days ago. A blackbird circled once, landed on the rail of the porch, then flew off like it had seen too much. A simple wooden box sat beside the stream, just where the pine roots tangled with stone. No one said who placed it there, but it hadn't been left by accident. The box was plain, carved by hand. The kind of thing someone makes when they don't know what else to do with their grief. Inside, someone had folded a worn piece of cloth, cream-colored, embroidered with 4 figures. 2 tall, 2 small, stitched in careful, uneven thread. Beneath it lay a doll made of vine and dried grass, its hair yellow and fraying. The last item was wrapped in flannel, a wooden flute, smooth from age, darkened at the edges by oil and skin. Still whole, still tuned. No one touched the box for weeks. The water in the creek rushed under thin layers of ice, whispering to no one in particular. Across the ridge, the burn scars had already begun to fade. New shoots pushed up through the ash, stubborn and green. But the old path through the mountains stayed quiet. The snow hadn't been broken there since the fire. Until that morning, she stepped out of the tree line like she'd never left. Meera. Her fur was streaked with gray now, darker, the winter light giving her edges that seemed almost stone. She walked slowly, one hand pressed to her chest, like the cold had settled somewhere deep inside her bones. Behind her, the forest remained unchanged. But her shoulders, those told a different story. She saw the box before she saw the cabin. She crouched beside it, hands brushing the lid with the kind of hesitation that belongs to someone who's lost things they were never supposed to hold in the first place. She opened it, lifted the cloth, saw the doll, the flute, the stitchwork. She held the doll first, ran her fingers over the faded threads. Then she picked up the flute. She didn't play it. She just held it and looked up. The cabin window was dark. No eyes behind the glass. No shapes at the edge of the porch. No familiar smells. But Meera stood there anyway, because memory doesn't always need witnesses. Sometimes it only needs presence. Far down the mountain, Bailey stood on the edge of the bus stop platform, backpack slung low, watching the fog lift over the hills. Her acceptance letter had come a week earlier. Appalachian State, anthropology, full ride. She hadn't told many people. Just left a note under Odell's last sketch, pinned with a silver button. "I'll come back when I understand more than stories," she'd written. "Maybe then I can tell them right." She turned as the bus pulled up, took one last look at the woods beyond the ridge, and stepped on board without looking back. In town, Sheriff McLaren cleaned out his office. The badge sat on the desk like it didn't belong there anymore. He packed the framed photo of his daughter into a box without wrapping it. On the wall beside her picture, tacked just beneath the county map, was a new sketch, charcoal on old parchment. A tall figure, kneeling, a child beside her. Someone had drawn a pine tree in the background, and in the margin, a name written in shaky cursive. Luma. He stared at the picture for a long time before pulling it down. He didn't throw it away, just folded it carefully, tucked it inside the same folder as the missing persons case, and locked it in the drawer. Then he turned off the light, stepped into the cold, and didn't look back. Back up the ridge, just as the last slant of sunlight pushed through the branches, Meera placed the flute gently back into the box. Not buried, not hidden, just there, waiting. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the forest one last time, and then she didn't vanish. She stayed. She stood there as the trees breathed in the dusk, holding the silence the way only someone who has truly listened can. And somewhere, deep inside the wood, where fire hadn't touched and names still echoed in the stone, something hummed. Not a song, not a cry, just a memory. Because some things aren't meant to be understood in the moment. Some stories aren't meant to end. They just shift, find new places to grow, new people to carry them. And maybe, if you're quiet long enough, if you leave enough space in your heart, they'll find you too. Especially when the wind changes. Especially when it sounds like a flute you've never heard, playing a song you somehow remember. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted across mountaintops or printed in newspapers. They're the quiet ones. The ones whispered between trees, carried in wind, etched into rock by hands that never learned how to write, but remembered everything. These are the stories that survive not because they're loud, but because they're true. Somewhere between what we believe and what we fear, there's a thin line, nearly invisible. And on that line walks the part of us that still hopes, the part that listens, even when others laugh, the part that chooses compassion, even when the world tells us to run or destroy or forget. Because deep down, we all carry something broken, something we couldn't save. And sometimes, the ones we call monsters are just echoes of our own lost chances. What if not everything in this world is meant to be captured, explained, or claimed? What if some things are sacred simply because they exist beyond our understanding? There's a kind of love that doesn't need language, a kind of grief that lives in silence, a kind of memory that carves itself into the land so deeply, even fire can't erase it. These are the threads that bind us, not just to each other, but to the earth, to the unseen, to the forgotten. And if we're quiet, really quiet, we might hear them. In the hush before the storm, in the rustle of pine needles at dusk, in the hollow space between notes of an old wooden flute. There's no map for finding the sacred in a world that's learned to stop looking. But maybe, just maybe, it finds us. when we're ready. And maybe the real question has never been, what is it? But will we choose to see it and let it be? Because some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be held. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If the story moved you, lingered in your thoughts, or stirred something quiet inside, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment, share your reflections, and don't forget to follow and subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that still live between the lines, waiting to be heard.